I wasn't alone seeking shelter from the storm. There's an unspoken rule up in the hills that no matter who you are, friend, rival, stranger, anyone, if you're ever in trouble and come across another hunter's cabin, you're welcome to seek shelter there. Maybe it's unspoken because it's common courtesy, or maybe it's unspoken because there's hardly anyone around to speak to. In the colder months especially, you'd be lucky to see another soul for days, sometimes weeks. But that's the rule: you need it, you use it. No judgment, no questions asked, just don't take anything that isn't yours. Now, I'm not some rugged, weathered outdoorsman who chews on pine cones and never cuts his hair, but I do enjoy hunting. I often leave my small village in the northern woods for stretches at a time and retreat to my hunting cabin in the hills. I'm a cautious person and I know the hills can be treacherous, so when I leave I make sure I'm prepared. I check the weather forecasts, gather supplies, bring backups, and ensure I've got enough of everything to last at least a week longer than I plan to stay, just in case. I always believed my precautions would keep me safe, but like a child's security blanket, they were only a thin illusion of security. There's no planning for when nature decides to show its teeth. That's why I never expected to get caught in a storm that day. It had started out clear and chilly, but as the hours passed, clouds began to gather. By the time they'd thickened into a heavy blanket, I was already on my way back to my cabin with a pair of rabbits slung over my shoulders. I'd named them Lunch and Supper. I was planning on eating supper for lunch and lunch for supper, just to amuse myself. It's the little things like that that keep the solitude from turning into loneliness. The snowfall seemed to come out of nowhere, like someone had shaken a snow globe. Except it wasn't a single flurry, it was a relentless, unending barrage. The last I'd checked, the weather reports hadn't mentioned a storm, and yet here I was, trudging through one. It got dark fast and I cursed myself for leaving my lantern back at my cabin. I'd planned on returning long before nightfall, so I hadn't thought I'd need it. I'd been wrong. Snow stung my face like tiny needles. I had to squint almost completely to keep the icy flakes from blinding me. The wind howled as gusts sliced through my clothes and chilled me to the bone. I could barely see a few steps ahead, and I couldn't see my own feet as they sank into the deepening snow. I'm not sure when I realized I was lost. At some point, I knew I should have reached my cabin, but all I saw was white, with faint shadows swaying in the wind. The rabbits on my back had frozen stiff and thumped against me with every step. I was running out of energy, running out of ideas, and starting to panic. I could have spun around in circles a dozen times and felt less disoriented than I did in that white void. And then I walked right into a cabin. Literally. It had become so dark and the snow so thick that I didn't see the structure until I stumbled into it. I pressed my hands against the wooden wall so I wouldn't lose it in the storm and felt my way around until I found a door. I wasn't just in trouble, this was life or death. In the unlikely event someone was inside, I knocked and waited for a response. Through the howling wind I thought I heard, "Come in." As I pushed the door open and stepped inside, a small heap of snow tumbled in with me. I didn't bother trying to kick it out as I fought to close the door against the wind. The relief was immediate. Without the wind biting at me, I'd stopped the countdown to freezing to death. "Thanks," I muttered. I turned toward the inside of the cabin and tried to get my bearings, but all I saw was darkness. I had no way of knowing how big the cabin was. Yeah, I'd walked around it, but I'd been stumbling, half blind, focused on finding the door, so I had no idea how much of it I'd covered. I could have circled it once. I could have circled it 3 times without realizing it. Through the darkness, all I could see was the faint outline of someone sitting in the corner. "You're a lifesaver," I said. He didn't answer. I fumbled around for a match, a candle, anything that might give off light, but all my fingers touched were chains and the barrels of hunting rifles. I stopped when I felt the cold metal of a bear trap. I didn't want to risk getting my hand caught in one of those. It was safer to sit still and wait for daylight. It occurred to me the stranger might have been seeking shelter too. "So," I began, keeping my tone light, "you the owner of this place?" The answer was more of a hiss than a word, but in that hiss, I heard a faint, yes. I sat on the floor, set my rabbits down beside me, and reached into my pack. Why I'd brought a sleeping bag and not a light source was beyond me. I stripped off my wet clothes and quietly slipped into the sleeping bag to warm up, making conversation as I did. "Thanks again. That storm came out of nowhere," he replied with slow, labored breaths, like an old man struggling to speak. "Dangerous?" "Yeah," I chuckled, "that's an understatement." "Hungry?" he exhaled. "You got a fireplace?" "I got a couple rabbits. I'll cook them up. It's the least I can do," I offered. His reply was drawn out like a low moan. "No." "Okay, as soon as the storm dies down, I'll go gather wood and make us a fire. Can you wait until then?" I saw his shadow shift slightly. There was a rattle of chains. "No," he said again, the word stretching out into a long eerie groan. "No. No, yes." The final "no" twisted strangely into a yes, like a note shifting abruptly higher. I craned my neck to look at the single window in the cabin. It was pitch black, pitch white. It was like an afterimage, visible against the dark wood but still inherently dark. I focused on it rather than the rest of the cabin because it was the only hint of light I could see. "If you don't mind, I'm going to try and get some sleep," I said wearily. He didn't respond, but that didn't surprise me. People in the hills don't talk much, even when they come down to the village for supplies. I shrugged it off and settled in for the night, but I felt something hard against my side. Sighing, I pushed my rabbits farther away and got comfortable. I was exhausted, so it wasn't hard for me to drift off despite the winds howling outside. I hugged myself in my sleeping bag and fell asleep. I was woken by a strange sound. A snapping crunch that made me bolt upright, thinking the roof was about to collapse under the weight of the snow. I braced myself, but as the sound came again, I realized it wasn't above me, it was next to me near my belongings. The shadow was gone from the corner, and I could hear deep, raspy breaths accompanying the crunch. "What are you doing?" I snapped. He retreated back to his corner with a rattle of chains. My adrenaline surged, though I wasn't sure why. Something about the stranger put me on edge. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. Whatever this guy was up to, I was safer with him than out in the storm. I grabbed my pack and propped myself against the wall, staring at the shadow, waiting for him to make a move. I kept myself awake and alert, never looking away even as the wind outside began to die down. Once or twice I felt my head droop and my eyes close, but each time, the faint rattle of chains jolted me back to attention. As the storm cleared and the sun rose, light began to seep into the cabin. The scene revealed itself slowly, like a photograph developing. I wasn't in a cabin, I was in a storage shed, maybe 12 feet long and 8 feet wide. There was no fireplace, which made sense for a shed. Tools, traps, and rifles lined the walls. The shadow in the corner slowly took shape, becoming a distinct figure. Thin. No, emaciated. Pale. No, ghostly. A man. No, a corpse. A corpse. I was stunned. He was dead. Not just dead, long dead. His body was shriveled and stiff, like a mummy without the wrappings. His hair hung in stringy clumps. His teeth protruded from shrunken lips, with a gap where a top tooth should have been. A dark stain of old blood soaked the wood beneath him. I followed it with my eyes to its source. His left foot caught in a bear trap. A chain led from the trap to an empty hook on the wall above him. It was long enough for him to move around, but not enough to reach the door or the saw hanging above it. My guess was the trap had fallen while he was out, and at some point he'd gotten caught in his own trap. He'd probably died of thirst or exposure. Look, I'm telling you, he wasn't breathing, he wasn't moving. He was dead and had been for a long time. I sat there, convincing myself I'd been delirious the night before. The exhaustion, the cold, the disorientation, it had made me imagine his voice. Those slow, hissing sounds I thought were replies were just the wind. I'd misinterpreted them because the isolation had gotten to me. The storm had played tricks on me, creating a living person out of someone who wasn't alive. It was a logical explanation, and I wish I could say it was true. Except I'm not the one who bit the head off supper. It's not my tooth I found on the floor next to me. My nails aren't the ones sticking out of the sleeping bag. I'm not the one who left the corpse's dry lips smeared with white fur. The next story will have you questioning everything. Let's get into it. In case you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means a lot and helps us continue bringing you more spine-chilling content. On the Northern Ice Road, you always help your fellow travelers. When people hear my wife's accent, they imagine a tall, fair-haired woman with a charming lilt who wears heels to the market. Reality couldn't be further from the stereotype. Clara is dark-haired, speaks English flawlessly, and is obsessed with running shoes. She does fit one stereotype, though. She never gets cold, having grown up in the far north until she was 19. Not in the capital, of course. Did you know the capital is relatively mild? There are regions in other countries where winters are far harsher than anything its residents endure. No, my wife comes from a remote village deep in the northern wilderness on the frozen plains. A bleak, frigid place inside the Arctic Circle, with brutal winters and even tougher people. A place that lives up to the stereotypes. I've met my in-laws only twice, including our wedding, both times when they traveled to visit us. Honestly, I never planned to visit Clara's hometown, but that changed when she received a call 10 days ago. Her mother had suffered a stroke. While her condition was stable for the moment, the local doctor warned that things could take a turn for the worse at any time. Transporting her to a better hospital was impossible. She was in no state for the kind of journey you're about to hear about. Clara made travel arrangements immediately. I had a valid visa from a work trip to the capital a month earlier, so I decided to join her. Now, getting to her hometown isn't simple. It involves a flight to the capital, then a connecting flight to Vorkuta, one of the largest towns in the northern wilderness. From there, it's an hour-long trip down the frozen river, by boat in summer and by car over the ice in winter. Getting to the capital quickly wasn't too difficult. There, however, we hit a snag. First, I learned I couldn't fly to Vorkuta with Clara because the town was closed to foreigners. Before we could process that, we were told Vorkuta's airport was shut down due to severe weather, with no improvement expected for days. I tried to comfort Clara as best I could, but updates about her mother's worsening condition left her distraught. Soon, Clara proposed an alternative. We could fly to a town farther south outside the storm's reach. For a reasonable fee, a family friend there agreed to drive us up the ice road to her hometown. Well, more like a nighttime journey, since he claimed it was safer to travel by headlights than in the dim daylight. I told Clara she was out of her mind. She, however, insisted her plan was sound, saying she'd traveled the Zimnik, what locals call their ice roads, many times with her father and it was perfectly safe. She refused to back down no matter how much I pleaded, and told me I was welcome to stay in the capital. Of course, that wasn't an option, so I reluctantly agreed. We flew to our next destination, and the cold hit me the moment I stepped off the plane. It was a different kind of cold, invasive, relentless, and it didn't care about the layers of sweaters and socks I wore. I shivered, imagining how much worse it would get. We met the driver who would take us north. He introduced himself as Ivan and called Clara Katia, the local version of her name. As for me, he didn't bother with my name, referring to me dismissively as Mr. Foreigner whenever he spoke to Clara. She later told me with a laugh that she hadn't mentioned I understood the language, though I doubt he would have cared. Ivan was supposed to be a few years younger than Clara but looked much older, his face and posture worn down by the harsh environment. He scoffed at our foreign-made boots and coats and said he'd pack extra jackets, wool socks and traditional boots for us just in case. His brother helped load his truck, which looked like it had survived the fall of the old regime, and then Ivan sat down to enjoy a shot of vodka. One for the road. Clara noticed my unease. "This isn't the city," she said quietly. "People here don't think much about drinking and driving. Don't worry, he won't have enough to get impaired. He's seen what happens when people do." Great. True to her word, Ivan stopped after one shot and climbed into the truck. He offered Clara the front seat, which, as far as I understood local customs, was basically a slap in my face. Whatever. As long as he got us there. The road was a dark ribbon of ice and packed snow, dusted with fresh powder from that morning. Snowdrifts lined both sides, spilling onto the road in places. Otherwise, it was an endless, flat expanse. In the first few hours, we passed a handful of cars heading the opposite way. Then a car going our direction sped past us and vanished into the darkness ahead. It was a tiny, rusted-out Lada. I gave up on understanding locals right then and there. Not long after the Lada passed, it began to snow. Lightly at first, then heavier and heavier. Ivan didn't seem concerned, and I tried to stay calm, which worked until the wind picked up. Unlike the snow, the wind came in hard from the start. Have you ever heard the wind howl and felt unsettled? Now imagine that sound in the depths of a black night, lit only by your headlights. Except for your vehicle, the world is silent and lifeless, frozen until spring. Not that you can see much through the thick snow now swirling in the wind, coating the windows. Our pace slowed to a crawl as Ivan muttered curses under his breath. "Maybe stop and wait it out?" I suggested nervously. "We can't," Clara said without consulting Ivan. "If we stop, the engine might not start again, and we'll be stranded until someone finds us. And it's been quiet today." The realization that we were at real risk of freezing to death hit me like a sledgehammer. I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes, silently praying for the best. The only response was the wind howling, and it sounded strange. It would start low and quiet, then rise to a deafening crescendo before cutting off abruptly. Then it would start again. And the sounds came from different directions, overlapping like a pack of wolves calling to each other. I opened my eyes to tension thick in the air. Clara and Ivan were both leaning forward, peering intently through the windshield, though it did little good. Ivan glanced back at me. "Don't worry, be happy," he said with a thick accent. "Everything is fine. Don't worry, foreigner." He was lying. I might have been useless on the ice road, but I was a lawyer and a good one at that. And Ivan was a terrible liar. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his voice was strained. He was scared, and that scared me. Ivan muttered something to Clara, too quick and quiet for me to catch. She nodded. What was that? I asked. There's a village about 40 minutes ahead if we keep this pace. We'll stop there and wait until morning. Got it? Sorry about the delay. In truth, I was relieved. Bad wind, huh? Clara grabbed my hand, her grip like a vice. Don't mention the wind. Another sound cut through the storm, a long metallic wail that sent chills down my spine. It took me a moment to recognize the sound of wind whistling through a chimney, and then another moment to realize there were no chimneys out here. I opened my mouth to speak and Clara's grip tightened. In that moment, I knew to stay silent. We drove in tense silence as a cacophony of sounds erupted around us. Wails, shrieks, howls. No way this was just the wind. The sounds grew closer, louder. I clutched Clara's hand as we stared desperately ahead. Through the snow, we barely made out a shape, a large, dark mass reflecting our headlights or perhaps emitting its own light. Ivan swore and swerved sharply. We were passing another car stuck in the snow, its hazard lights blinking. Stop, Clara said, her voice sharp. What? Ivan snapped. Are you crazy? Stop, she repeated. On the ice road you help. That's the rule, remember? Ivan gave her a long, hard look that made me uneasy. That's the rule on the road, he muttered, slowing the truck without stopping. I opened the door and peered out. The driver of the stuck car was already running toward us. I recognized the vehicle as the Lada that had passed us earlier. Thank God you stopped, the driver began. Get in, idiot. Ivan shouted, and the young man clambered into the back seat. He was just a kid, no older than 21, with reddish-brown hair and a patchy beard. He looked frozen and terrified. Thank God, he whispered. I thought they'd get me. They? I asked, confused. Clara and Ivan turned to glare at the kid, their expressions deadly. I mean the wind and snow, he stammered. I had a sudden, sinking feeling that it was too late for that, even though I still had no idea what was happening. We drove on, the howls and shrieks outside growing louder. What's your name? I asked him in my best attempt at the local language. Alexei. Alexei Sokolov. My parents are, well, it doesn't matter. I shouldn't have been driving, but I wanted to make it to my girlfriend's birthday and... Both of you shut up, Clara snapped, and we obeyed. Immediately, I noticed the change in the sounds outside. They were louder now. High-pitched shrieks pierced my ears. Low, guttural growls seemed to surround the truck. And every so often, a deep, bone-rattling roar cut through the night. The truck sped up. I glanced at Ivan and realized he was flooring the gas pedal, visibility be damned. The old vehicle lurched forward as fast as it could, but the encroaching noise made it clear we weren't moving fast enough. Then we hit something. The truck jerked violently, and we were thrown forward as it skidded to a halt. My head slammed into the back of Clara's seat. What was that? I groaned. Must have hit a chunk of ice, Clara said, her voice muffled. I remember focusing on her lips, pale and thin. The dull pain in my head exploded into something sharp and overwhelming, and I slumped into the seat. He's out, Alexei exclaimed. I wanted to correct him, but my voice wouldn't cooperate. My eyelids felt like lead. I could barely keep them open enough to see the three locals huddled together, the truck's flickering light casting shadows on their faces. What now? Alexei asked nervously. Well, Clara said, her voice calm and cold, why don't you go out and check what we hit? See if we can clear it? What? We helped you, didn't we? Clara's blue eyes glinted in the dim light. So help us in return. On the ice road, you help each other. That's the rule. Ivan grunted in agreement. Then he reached behind the seat and pulled out a rifle, aiming it at Alexei. The kid whimpered. You know they're out there. Well, Clara said, her voice icy, you'd better not talk about them. Better not even think about them. My eyes closed against my will. I heard the door open, followed by a rush of cold air. Then I passed out completely, dreaming of screams and a single earth-shaking roar that filled the night. I woke up the next day on a couch in a local family's home. Clara fussed over me, and once she was sure I was coherent, she hurried me into the truck, saying we could finish the drive by daylight and have a proper doctor check me out in her hometown. I settled into the back seat, vague memories haunting me. Where's the kid? Alexei? What kid, darling? Clara asked, genuinely confused. There was no kid. We traveled alone, Ivan added in the local language. I wondered how he knew what I was asking, or that I'd understand his answer. But aloud, I only said, that young guy with the reddish hair? Sweetie, I'm really worried. You must have hit your head harder than I thought. We'll get you checked out as soon as we're back home. Maybe even a full exam in the capital? I didn't know what to say after that. We made it the rest of the way without incident. Unfortunately, Clara's mother had slipped into a coma before we even set out, and she passed away a few hours after we arrived. Clara didn't get to say goodbye. She's devastated, so I'm doing my best to comfort her. We're staying until the funeral, and I'm not looking forward to the trip back. Clara's father gave me a proper winter coat, so I packed my inadequate foreign one. As I folded it, I noticed a few reddish hairs clinging to the fabric, and I felt so cold. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more thrilling stories. And hit the bell icon to never miss an update.